So in this video, we're going to talk about color theory. The first question asked is, what is color? The answer to that question is, color is actually light. So how does light break down? The next question we have to ask is, to answer that, is how does the eye see color? The eye sees color through what we call the retina. Now the retina is the sensitive surface line on the back of the eye, which is located right here. In this diagram would be this blue line. And in that area consists of what we call rods and cones. The rods detect light and the cones detect hues. Hue is another word for describing color. So in this diagram we have the light rays here. The pupil is opening, letting those light rays into the eye, hitting the back of the eye where the rods and cones are, and all those messages being the light rays, are being broken down into millions of hues, are being transferred through the optical nerve to the brain. And that's how our eye sees color. So how does light break down into color? So let's look at that next. So light is broken down into wavelengths. Wavelengths are the areas and sections of the spectrum of light. And those are measured in what we call nanometers. So let's look at the wavelengths. Wavelengths are broken down into red, red-orange, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. If we look at the diagram I have here, which explains visible light is another word for saying white light. Let's look. Red being 700 wavelengths. The next is red-orange being 650 wavelengths. Orange being 600 wavelengths. Yellow being 550 wavelengths. Green being 500 wavelengths. Blue being 450 wavelengths. And then your purple, which is 400. Past this area being the spectrum of light, if I go this direction, I get into the ultraviolet, which are the most dangerous wavelengths of light. And then this direction, I then get into the infrared, which is like science and technology wavelengths. So the next question to ask is, how does our digital age use light for color? If we took specific colors out of the spectrum of light and we used them, we would first use what we call RGB. Now the RGB stands for red, green, and blue. The red, this is a red from the spectrum of light in this generalized area. This is a blue that we are utilizing from the blue wavelengths of this generalized area. This is a green that we are using from this green to yellow generalized area. The secondary colors of white light are what we call CMY. C standing for cyan, M standing for magenta, and yellow being the Y. If I was to take 100% of this green and 100% of the red and put them together, I would get yellow. If I was to take 100% of the green and 100% of the blue, combine them together, I would get the cyan. If I took 100% of the blue and 100% of the red, I would get magenta. That's how the secondary colors of light are formed. If I was to take all the RGB and put them together, I would get white. Hence, if I was to put all the secondary colors together, all 100%, I would get white light. White light being the middle. If I took all the colors and put them together, I would get white light. If I subtracted and removed all the colors out of white light, I would be left with black. This is how the computer monitor works, and this is what we see on every digital display device in our digital age. So breaking down color, the next question we have to ask is, what is a pigment? A pigment is what we call an earth material that contains a color based on how our eyes read it. Color classified as a hue. This is the color wheel of color. This is the color wheel of light. But how do they go hand in hand? First, let's break this down. Let's break down the color wheel of color. What we have is we have the primaries, which is blue, red, and yellow. The primary colors in the color wheel of light, remember, is green, red, and blue. So it's a little bit different. In the color wheel of color, we also have the secondary colors, which is called violet, orange, and green. Remember, back in the color wheel of light, we had magenta, cyan, and yellow. Okay, so they are a little bit different, but how does the pigments work? Blue, red, and yellow being the primaries, violet, orange, and green being the secondaries. If I combined a primary with one of the secondaries, I get what's called a tertiary, but we always say the primary name first. We say blue-green. Here, combined, we say yellow-green. The next tertiary in line would be yellow and orange. We get yellow-orange. Red and orange, we get red-orange. And then red and violet, we get red-violet. Blue and violet, we get blue-violet. This is the generalized color wheel of color. Keep in mind that there are thousands of blues, thousands of violets, thousands of reds, thousands of orange, thousands of yellow, and thousands of greens across pigments within the color wheel of color. So the next question. How do we see a pigment if we are actually seeing light? Pigment can be any kind of color of anything found in nature. So a leaf from a tree has a type and shade of green. That green falls into one of the shades of green in this category right here, under the green of the color wheel of color. Let's say a blue marble rock. That blue marble rock would fall into one of the shades of blue in this generalized area of the color wheel of color, so forth and so forth. Keep in mind that the color of paint is created through pigments, which are the earth materials. Latex and water are combined with pigments to create paint. Latex makes it stick, water makes it flow. So question, how do we see a pigment if we're actually seeing light? Now I found this diagram online through my research, and I found that this was pretty much the best visual example and description that explains this process. Really, it's a 1, 2, 3 process, and it goes like this. All the invisible colors of sunlight shine on, in this diagram, for example, an apple. Okay. Now those invisible colors are, looking back, the spectrum of light, those wavelengths of light. The surface of the red apple absorbs all the colored light rays, absorbing all of them, okay, except for those corresponding to red, because that is the pigment, the color of the apple. Looking back at the color wheel of color, red, one of those pigments in this generalized area on the color wheel of color, is the apple, and therefore that is the only color out of the spectrum of light that is being casted to our eyes, or the human eye. And in return, the eye receives the reflected red light and sends messages to the brain. And what is interpreting those messages? Well, looking back, it is the rods and cones. So moving forward, so what makes us see a blue box in reality? Well, the answer is, if we were to look at a blue box in reality based on the, this image I have here, let's say this is a real blue box, we would see blue and considered the color as blue because white light hits the surface of the object. The object is absorbing all the wavelengths of the spectrum of light, and only the blue wavelengths that are associated to that pigment, that is basically the box itself, are being casted to our eyes, so we're capable of interpreting the box as blue based on that pigment from the color wheel of color. Again, that is the only pigment that is being casted based on the wavelengths of light to our eye, and that's how we are able to interpret it as a blue box. Now also keep in mind If we were to put this, remember this is a representational image, but let's say this was a real box, and let's say we were to put this box outside in natural lighting. Now here's what's most interesting. The sun, we know there's a sunrise and a sunset. The strongest white light is going to be casted during the afternoon hours between 12 and 2 o'clock. Because there's not as much light casted on this object, if it was outside again in reality, during the sunrise and sunset, there would be a different tone of color, okay? And that's how that pigment is reacting to the amount of white light that's being casted on it. And in return, again, that's how our eye is interpreting that color. And that's how we're able to know that things appear darker during the later hours or the earlier hours of the day. Again, same applies. So what makes us see the red ball in reality? Same answer, but now the red wavelengths are being reflected our eyes and interpreted by the rods and cones as red. Okay? That pigment or association of wavelengths of light that correspond to that hue and various shades of color of red. And that's how light and pigments from the color wheel of color work hand in hand. So now that we've established pigments and how light breaks down into color and how our eyes read pigments through use of light, the next section we're going to talk about is what we call color psychology as it applies to human emotions. Every color within the spectrum of light creates an emotional feel, a mood, as it applies to human psychology. The color violet represents royalty, valor, elegant images of rich individuals and fine dining. The rich. Blue is associated with expansive, reliable, sad, lonely, depressed, but most interesting, educated. So it's a mix. It can be expansive, which is good, but then it can also represent cold, depressed, but education. Green. Green is associated with growth. Many companies that deal with investing, their logos are branded using the color of green. Based on human psychology, green being linked to the color of money, everyone wants their money to grow. Green is also linked to nature, living things, wilderness. Aqua. Aqua is created through the mix between blue and green, also known as blue-green with an added tint, and tint being white. Aqua is associated with tropical or sea environments, but most interesting, what I have here is Egyptians, because the Egyptians in history lived along a river called the Nile River, and the clay sediment of that river was the color of blue-green, or in this case, aqua. And the Egyptians used that clay to create their jewelry. A lot of the aqua stones are found in their gold artifacts of jewelry. Orange. Orange represents appetizing, hot, on menus that really involve sizzling food items. Red can be good or bad. Red is represented through romantic, danger, life, because the color of blood is red, and many festivals use red. Yellow. Yellow is associated with being happy, jovial. A really great video you can watch that provides more terminology as applies to color psychology is Maria Claudia Cortez video called Color Emotion. To view this video, you can go to this link right here. The website looks like this. Now that we understand how color works, let's look at color schemes using the color wheel of color, hence pigments. When describing color, the best word to use is what we call contrast, as it applies to color combinations throughout a composition, where one color relates to another. Again, as we talked about before, the primary colors are blue, red, and yellow. These three colors form a color scheme across the color wheel color, which I'll talk about here in a second. Here's an illustration using the primary colors. You can see how the color of red is balanced throughout as much as the blue and the yellow, creating unity and using the color scheme to form this really successful illustration. Secondary colors are violet, green, and orange mentioned earlier. What's really interesting about this color scheme, also being a color scheme, which I'll talk about here in a second, you can mix these colors further to create the other colors that we call cadmium red, dark violet, and olive. Here's an illustration using that mixture of colors. Orange and violet mixed together create cadmium red, violet and green create a dark violet, and orange and green create olive. In this composition, you can see how all the colors, including the original orange, violet, and green, were mixed and blended together to formulate the final look. Tertiary colors are the best remembered by saying the phrase 2 yellows, 2 blues, and 2 reds. There are always 2 yellows, 2 blues, and 2 reds to break down and locate and find all the tertiary colors without having to look at the color wheel of color. They are yellow-green, yellow-orange, blue-green, blue-violet, red-orange, and red-violet. Again, 2 yellows, 2 blues, 2 reds. Color value is the idea of taking a color and adding black or white to that color to create darkness or lightness, hence either taking away the color intensity or increasing the color intensity. Again, that's what we associate with color value. A monochromatic color scheme is when we use the grayscale and we add one hue to that grayscale. In this diagram here, you'll notice here's the grayscale as it pertains to color value, and we've taken one hue, added to that grayscale, which is red, and look at how the red changes across the grayscale. This is what we call adding the one hue to that grayscale, a monochromatic color scheme, where you can use multiple shades and tints of that red throughout a composition, and only that sequence and order of those shades and tints of that red. Simultaneous contrast is a color scheme where we take a color and its complement, mix them together, and then create 2 more colors using that combination. Here, as we mentioned before, a complementary color or complementary color scheme is a color that appears across from its complement on the color wheel of color. So let's look. Here in this color wheel, we have blue. Its complementary color directly across from this color on the color wheel of color is orange. If we look here, red, its complementary color, which is directly across, is green. If we look here, violet, its complementary color directly across is yellow. So now back to simultaneous contrast. Simultaneous contrast, again, is when we take a complementary color scheme, we mix them together, and we create brown. Keep in mind, a complementary color scheme is a color scheme itself. Simultaneous contrast is building it further. Once that brown is established, mixing both the colors together, we then take that brown and we mix it back into the original colors to create an orange brown. Hence, this brown mixed with the blue creates a blue brown. And then we have the 5 color scheme. What's most interesting, especially this simultaneous contrast color scheme, using the blue and the orange, it's used quite often in fashion design. Another thing about complementary colors is in that example I used the idea of blue and orange. Another complementary color scheme, again, is red and green. And then another one is violet and yellow. Remember that tertiary colors are also complementary color schemes, where here yellow-orange and blue-violet are a complementary color scheme. Blue-green is the complementary color of red-orange, and using just these two colors can be done within a composition. But let's look more at the simplified color scheme of blue and orange, violet and yellow, and red and green. Believe it or not, if I mix violet and yellow, I will get the lightest shade of brown. If I mix blue and orange, I will get the medium shade of brown. And if I mix red and green, I get the darkest tone of brown. And that's how brown is formed using the color wheel of color. Another color scheme that you can use is what we call positive negative space. This involves only using black and white, where black represents the positive that creates the form, and white, being the negative, encompasses the form or is used throughout the composition to create the lines. A grayscale color scheme is using nothing but mixing of white into black and formulating multiple shades of those two colors combined across what we call a grayscale. Grayscale shading is used quite often in storyboarding in the industry. Complementary colors that appear directly across from each other on the color wheel of color, again, are red, its complementary color being green, blue, its complementary color being orange, yellow, its complementary color being violet. A split complementary color scheme is when we have a complementary color facing its complement. But instead of using the color that lies directly across the color wheel of color, we use the colors that lie next to it. Here in this example, for a split complementary color scheme, we have green, but instead of using red, we use red-violet and red-orange. Analogous colors. Analogous color scheme are three colors that lie next to each other on the color wheel of color. Here, for this example, we have green, blue-green, and yellow-green. Green, blue-green, and yellow-green. Keep in mind that any three colors that lie next to each other on the color wheel of color can be an analogous color scheme. Triadic, or triads is what we call them, are triangles, perfect equilateral triangles on the color wheel of color. Back when we were talking about the primary colors, they are actually a primary color scheme using a triadic color scheme. The secondary colors are also a triadic color scheme. Here, if we notice, these are the secondary colors: violet, green, and orange. The best way to find a triadic color scheme is don't think about the colors that are being used, but think about the colors that are not being used. Here, if you notice, finding a triadic color scheme, there's always three colors that are not being used between the colors that are. And hence, that triangle can be rotated across the color wheel of color. The last color scheme is a tetrad. A tetrad can be formed in two ways. One is the rectangle. Again, like the triadic, the best way to find a tetrad that's a rectangle is think about the colors that are not being used, where one color is between a set and three colors are between each set. Here, if you notice, I've got one color not being used between two sets of colors, and then I have three colors not being used before I find the next one, and then again, the one color not being used, and across from these three are the other three colors that are not being used. And hence, focusing on the colors not being used is what helps locate the rectangle. And this rectangle can be rotated across the color wheel of color. Finally, the square. The best way to find a square tetrad is focus on the two colors that are not being used between each set. Here, if you notice, I have a color. I have two colors not being used, which means this color is being used. These two colors are not being used. There's the color that's being used in the color scheme. These two colors not being used, and here's the color being used in the color scheme. Again, when pinpointing and locating rectangles and squares for tetrads, and locating triangles for triadic, think about the colors that are not being used to help locate the sets on the color wheel of color. That concludes color theory breakdown. Keep in mind that you can go to my LinkedIn page at linkedin.com if you would like to link up with me and have me as a resource and a reference in your list of contacts. You can send me a message at my LinkedIn, and that will reach out to my Yahoo email, hence my Gmail accounts, and I can always be there to help you. Thank you for watching, and look forward to working with you.